Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. With the world's biggest economies at much of a standstill due to coronavirus, the US alone recorded over 20 million unemployment claims over the last month, with some economists comparing this financial crisis to the Great Depression of the 1930s. The corona pandemic has not only brought about death and illness, it has shaken economies across the globe. While children take time off school and wait for their extended holidays to end, their parents and many millions more will be thinking of how to bring food to the table and how to find work. In this broadcast, we'll be looking at the global economic impact of COVID-19. We want to hear from you and how this has impacted you. Send us your stories and questions by emailing live@mta.tv, tweet us using the handle @COVID19MTA, or find us on Instagram. Remember to use the hashtag COVID-19Impact. As usual, we'll be speaking to experts from around the globe on this matter, but first, let's take a look at the global implications of this pandemic.
Earlier this week, the IMF said the world economy would shrink at its fastest pace in decades, raising fears it will be the worst recession since the 1930s Great Depression. China's economy shrank 6.8% in the first 3 months of 2020, the country's first such contraction on record, and a stark sign of the financial impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Almost half the world is under lockdown. This means that most non-essential businesses are closed. Prolonged closure over weeks and weeks has meant a sharp rise in unemployment, which has left tens of millions of families all across the developed countries alone without means to support or feed themselves.
I mean, it's an incredible thing that's happened. Nobody thought this was possible. We had the greatest economy in the world. Everybody was doing the best ever, and then all of a sudden they said you have to shut down the country and they have to shut down the world.
Just in the US, 22 million people have become jobless and are applying for benefits in the past few weeks. It is the worst stretch of American job losses on record, with much of the world's biggest economy at a standstill due to lockdown measures put in place to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Britain will suffer its deepest recession for 300 years if the lockdown continues into the summer, with the British economy posed to shrink by 35%, and unemployment has already risen by 2 million. World governments are giving trillions of dollars in stimulus packages to help prop up their economies. Sovereign debts that they are racking up may push the global economy into a second recession. Many of the European countries that are among the worst affected by the pandemic, such as Italy and Spain, already had weak fiscal positions before the outbreak. A potential debt crisis in any of these countries would quickly spread to other developed countries and emerging markets, sending the global economy into another, possibly much worse, downturn. So what does this mean for you? If you are among the people who have become unemployed or are suffering losses due to your business being shut, then there are a few options available if you live in Europe, US or Canada. If you are a business owner in the UK, you can apply for the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, as the government has released a £330 billion package of bailout loans. If you are employed or fear losing your job, then there's schemes that the government has made available that will ensure your employer continues to pay for the foreseeable future. For business owners in the US, the government has released $349 billion in relief for American workers and small businesses. This is part of the larger $2 trillion stimulus package, looking after larger businesses, the unemployed, and a check for $1,200 for most Americans who fit a criteria. And there are similar schemes in most developed countries designed to help business owners, recently unemployed, and those worrying about paying rent. The best thing to do is to have a quick look at what your government is offering you at this time. And please remember, for any information you need regarding your employment, business, or even concerns over food, do reach out to your local Ahmadiyya Muslim community members. And not only will they be more than happy to provide you any assistance, they'll bring over food items regularly if you need them and check up on you daily to see that you're doing okay.
Our first guest is Frances Cassandra Coppola, a finance and economics writer and commentator. Her blog, Coppola Comment, is one of the top economics and finance blogs, and she is a regular feature on the Financial Times Alpha Villa blog. She is also the author of The Case of People's Quantitative Easing, and she joins us now. Thank you very much for joining us, Frances. And can I go to our first question, which is, if we look back at history and compare the economic downturn we are experiencing now, what would you compare it to?
Well, this is an economic downturn on a scale we haven't seen for maybe a century. The kind of occasions we compare it with in the past are the 1918, 1919 flu pandemic, which killed an awful lot of people and was followed by, in 1920, a very, very deep recession. I've also compared it actually to the Irish famine in the mid-19th century, when over 1 million people, a fifth of Ireland's population, died. That was caused by a famine, not by a pandemic, but an awful lot of those people died of disease. And as with this one, it was policy errors really that potentially caused the deaths. We're trying not to make those kind of errors again.
And what kind of lessons can we learn from the past, and how do you feel we can come out of this downturn in the economy?
Well, I think the most important thing we've learned from the past is that in the past we didn't really attempt to protect people. But there are some indications that lockdowns, if they're done very early, do work. They do stop the spread of disease, but they cause misery for people who have no form of support. And so you end up with poverty, deaths from poverty as a result. So this time we're trying to impose lockdowns on an unprecedented scale, but at the same time protect people so that we don't get poverty deaths, and also trying to protect businesses so that when we can come out of the lockdown, we can get moving quickly so that businesses can start themselves up again and we can get the economy back as quickly as possible. These were things that weren't done in the past, and it is a matter, when you learn from the past, you learn from the mistakes of the past, you learn from the things you didn't do, as well as from the things that you did. So we've learned from the past that lockdowns work, but we've also learned from the past that we need to protect people and try and keep businesses alive.
So that naturally brings me to my next question. How can governments help the most vulnerable people at grassroots level?
Well, I think it's actually quite difficult. I mean, governments are taking various different approaches to this. So we've got programs to try and keep people in their jobs and continue to pay their wages. We've got extensions to unemployment insurance. In some countries, we've got extensions to other welfare benefits in other countries. It's all a bit piecemeal, really, because governments haven't really got any systems in place to deal with this kind of situation where you've got to get money to just about everybody in a huge hurry. Going forward for the future, it would be better if we had some kind of universal basic income in place so that we aren't scurrying around desperately trying to get money to vulnerable people.
Thank you very much, Frances. And our next guest is Daniel Lacalle. Daniel is the chief economist at Tresis, with a PhD in economics and an author of several books. He has over 24 years of experience in the energy and finance sectors. Daniel is ranked as one of the top 20 economists in the world and joins us now. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us and your time. I'd like to begin by asking you what impact the coronavirus pandemic will have on the world's economy.
According to our estimates, the global economy is going to suffer the biggest shock in 2020 seen since the Second World War. The impact on global GDP is likely to be very substantial. It's negative growth almost in every economy except for a few. And I would say that it's an important factor here as well is how severe the downturn will be both in emerging markets as well as developed economies.
So Daniel, how can developing countries like India or Pakistan prevent a downward economic spiral and bounce back up?
India is likely to experience a very important impact, very, very important, because it's a country that was already seeing a weakening in growth before the coronavirus hit. I think that from the perspective of Pakistan and other similar economies, the impact is likely to be fundamentally on weaker levels of tourism, weaker levels of industrial output, and I would also think that consumption is going to be hit.
Thank you for your time, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Now, the problems experienced in the developing world during lockdown are very different to those in the developed world. Let's take a look further.
Combating COVID-19 calls for social distancing and keeping the country under lockdown. The more contained you want the novel coronavirus to be, the more you will need to lock down your country, and the more fiscal freedom you will require to ease the deeper recession that will result. The COVID-19 pandemic has the potential to devastate parts of the developing world. With advanced developed nations being greatly affected, the economies of developing nations are in need of additional assistance from the international community. The situation in the advanced economies is likely to be much more benign than what developing countries are facing, not only in terms of the disease burden, but also in terms of the economic devastation they will face. The scale of the threat that some developing nations are facing is not lost on the International Monetary Fund. In light of this, on Thursday, April the 16th, 2020, the International Monetary Fund announced that 5 wealthy countries pledged to provide $11.7 billion towards emergency funding for poor countries. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund, spoke of this effort at a recent press conference.
We called on the membership to urgently provide $17 billion of concessional financing for our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. And today in this meeting, we got 70% of our ask met by commitments of the members. And I want to thank wholeheartedly Japan, the UK, France, Australia, and Canada for making firm commitments totaling $11.7 billion.
More than 90 developing countries have already approached the IMF for financial assistance. Both the IMF and the World Bank have also called for official bilateral creditors to suspend debt payments by the poorest developing countries. G20, the group of 20 major economies, have agreed to temporary debt relief for the world's poorest nations, as defined by the United Nations, amid the pandemic. The finance minister of Saudi Arabia, this year's G20 host, spoke about the measures expected to free up more than $20 billion so it can be redirected towards improving health systems and fighting the pandemic.
Our actions today include a G20 initiative to suspend debt service payment for the poorest countries. All bilateral official creditors will participate in this initiative.
Sub-Saharan African governments do not have as much flexibility when trying to counter the effects that a government-imposed lockdown can have on individuals and their livelihoods. Beyond the deaths and human suffering, markets around the world are dealing with threatening circumstances. Most developing countries depend on foreign income from a combination of commodity exports, tourism, and remittances. COVID-19 has halted the industries almost instantly, and this has left the economies short of funds and the government short of tax revenues. To successfully flatten the COVID-19 curve and minimize the economic impact, nations need to come together at the international level, especially for the stability of the global economy.
Now, one developing country which experienced significant issues with regards to the pandemic was India. With a population of over 1.3 billion people, India went into lockdown in a matter of hours. To discuss this situation in India is Indian politician and columnist Sudhindra Kulkarni. Kulkarni helped former Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee write his speeches. Welcome to the program, Mr. Kulkarni.
Thank you so much for having me on this program. These are difficult, challenging times for India and the entire world, but we are all united in our commitment to overcome the corona crisis. And these kind of conversations are extremely helpful. Thank you once again. Let's begin.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened in India and what the effects have been on the country as a whole?
The good thing is that even though India is by no means immune to the coronavirus crisis, so far relative to some countries in Europe and in the West, and also relative to China, India is faring relatively better because so far we have just about 13,000 cases, active cases, and even the mortality is relatively less than 500, but we cannot be complacent. We are a huge nation of 1.3 billion people. There is no scope for being lax. And as you know, our government has extended the lockdown period beyond the first 3 weeks to another 3 weeks. And this has helped in ensuring that people stay indoors, and social distancing has contained the spread of the virus. And we have a very good coordination between the central government, the state government, and the local governments.
Sorry to interrupt, but what about the Indian economy and the weak and the poor? Where does that leave them?
This is a question that really concerns all of us in India who are committed to the ideal of an equitable and inclusive India, a fair and just India, because India, even though India has prospered considerably in recent decades, it is an extremely iniquitous society. The socio-economic divide has widened, and this is a pre-existing condition as far as COVID-19 disease is concerned.
Can I come to the last question, which is, in a world where everyone is trying to look after their own, what hope can we offer the poorest of society?
You know, this attitude of each country looking after itself or being concerned about itself is extremely unhelpful for overcoming the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. There is unfortunately a certain short-sightedness on the part of many countries, many governments, each country looking after itself, thinking about itself at a time when the world needs more unity, more solidarity, more cooperation. As far as India is concerned, we are really concerned and worried at the spread of both xenophobia and Islamophobia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kulkarni. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Here's a message of hope from the children of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community worldwide.
We are in this together. Wash your hands. Stay warm.
Be strong.
Stay safe. Smile. Pray. And beat COVID-19.
Now that brings us to the end of today's broadcast. We hope that rather than making you worry, this insight into the economic impact of the pandemic has helped you to become more aware of the situation and think of ways and means to plan ahead. With that, we take your leave and ask you to continue to send your questions to us at live@mta.tv and follow us on Twitter and Instagram to keep up to date with the latest information. We hope and pray that you and your loved ones are kept safe and well in this testing time, inshallah. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.